I'm super excited. I had expected maybe 2 people for a small, intimate conversation around one table, and we've got a room full of people. So this is great. Last day of a conference, oftentimes, especially a 2-hour session, this is fantastic. So I'm really excited to talk today about school change, specifically around personalized learning. I'm going to give you guys a second since this is a brand new deck. I do want to mention all of this is case sensitive, so you have to make sure all those are capital, and then the remaining, yeah. No, so here's the challenge. Remember I just mentioned that I thought I was going to be with 2 people around a small table? So every single thing that's in front of you is a link in the deck. If you don't have a device with you today, if you're like operating just off of a phone, then you might want to kind of share the handouts, but it's going to not necessarily, there's not a ton of work that's going to happen in those handouts. You're just going to need them potentially at one point. All right. How we doing? You guys ready to get started? Maybe write it down for a neighbor in case somebody comes in late. You can pass it to them. That way everybody can get into the deck if they want. We are filming today, so I'm going to be a little bit more careful about what I say than I normally am. I'll probably drop at least probably less swear words than I normally do, so this is going to be good. My name is Shawn Rubin. I'm the Chief Education Officer at the Highlander Institute. I am a former teacher, mostly taught in kindergarten. Came out of the classroom in like 2012 and started doing work around technology integration in schools, and then we began to get some contracts. As you know, that was kind of a big booming moment for blended learning. And in Rhode Island, we have now kind of really taken over almost the entire, I wouldn't say taken over, that's a terrible form of words, and I'm on camera. This is not going to work well today. We scaled across the state. We're now in like 80% of the districts and LEAs in Rhode Island and are now doing work nationally as well. Really where we focus is, I think, a place that a lot of people don't focus, which is on the deep implementation and kind of continuous improvement of this work. A lot of people get into school change from a redesign standpoint, have a lot of really lofty, beautiful ideas, and then kind of leave, and those ideas are left to kind of, do their own thing. And oftentimes it doesn't work. And so what we're trying to do today in this book, in this framework, what I'll be talking about is how do you make change stick, and then how do you also make change scale? And so those are really 2 of the big pieces. Now, the real key here is you're going to see that a lot of time and energy gets spent up front. And so that's a big part of what we're going to get into today just due to time. But we do get into the entire process of the framework as you go through the book, and we're going to talk about the entire process today. So we're going to have some time for chatting with each other. We're going to have some time for some deeper simulations. And I thought we were going to have some time to go around the room and really get to know each other, because if you're going to do personalized learning, you got to really kind of have a sense for who each other are. It's really about relationships and knowing each other. And so just because of there are so many of you, which is super exciting. Could we maybe just do a quick zip? Like, you could be super quick. I'm so-and-so. This is where I'm coming from. This is what I do. And just kind of get around the room real quick, just so I have a sense of like who's with schools and who's not with schools, because that makes a big difference. Do you mind starting? You just walked in and I'm putting you on the spot. Yeah.
I'm Laura Custom-Border. I'm from Cajon Valley, so right here in San Diego, and I teach 5th grade.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Coach kind of a thing? Yeah, perfect. All right. Cajon Valley is going to basically run this session. What memo got put out about this session? That's crazy. It's like a staff meeting up in here. You want to keep going? In Cajon Valley. All right. All right, some variability. I love it. Okay, fantastic. Okay, education company. All right, excellent.
I work for an education company out of New York. We are implementing the flipped class model.
Okay.
Including in places like Harlem Children's Zone.
Okay.
So I'm very excited to be here because we are personalizing the learning for students.
Excellent, excellent. Brian, take it. All right. All right. All right. All right. How's it going? Good to see you again. All right. In the back, you just walked in. We're introducing ourselves. Sorry. Western New York. All right. All right. Okay. Okay. Like a company? Okay. Awesome. Nerica. Look at it. Today she's like near Cajon Valley. She's never introduced herself that way ever before, but today.
My name is Lucas Hiley. I'm an elementary school principal from Raffle.
I saw your presentation yesterday. And the K12 pitch? Yes, it was awesome. Thank you. Okay. Okay. All right. Welcome. All right. Everyone's a member of the tribe today. All right. Oh, cool. All right. All right. Did you say kinder? Nice. All right. Okay.
Jennifer Sorrar, kindergarten teacher for Cajon Valley.
All right, kinder. Nice. All right, we got a lot of kindergarten. Yeah.
I'm Michael Ecker. I'm a principal of middle school, Carlsbad, so north of Cajon Valley.
Everything is in relation today. We're going to connect every single aspect of my presentation to Cajon Valley.
I'm Aaron Nelson, elementary principal in Carlsbad.
All right.
Lori Elliott, I'm a K12 Humanities Program Coordinator in Greenwich, Connecticut.
Okay. Nice.
Good morning, Adrienne Klein, ESL and World Language Coordinator, also from Greenwich, Connecticut.
Okay. And this whole table is Cajon Valley, right? All right, so let's just go through your roles then around the table.
Principal.
Yeah?
Facilitator.
Okay.
Math facilitator.
Okay.
Math facilitator.
All right.
Coordinator.
Okay.
Ed tech facilitator.
All right.
Professional learning facilitator.
Okay.
Language arts facilitator.
Awesome.
Middle school language arts facilitator.
Okay.
Science facilitator.
Director of Family and Community Engagement.
Awesome. Great. Glad to have you here. So I really hope that ASU GSV gave Cajon Valley a deal, because this is crazy. Wow, at least a discount code. All right. So welcome. We're going to do a quick little exercise at your table. I want you to, and I don't have enough stickies, I'm sure I don't have enough stickies. So you're going to need stickies, because this is also how you qualify to win in our raffle later. We're going to raffle off a couple books at the end. So you're going to write your name, but you're going to also pick a color, and these colors don't match. So you're going to have to do your best to like proxy. But we're going to call the orange is orange, the green is green, but the red is actually the yellow. So that's super helpful. So just grab one, write your name on it, and kind of stick it somewhere where folks can see, up on your lapel or something where people can see at your table. Yep, yellow is red. That's the only thing you kind of got to remember, is that yellow is red, because I didn't have any yellow. So this is green. For those of you that are confused, this is actually green. We're going to call this green. Even though, is this yellow? No, it's green, right? It's green, okay. It's just the lighting. Yellow is red. So stick it, but that's yellow. That's proxying for yellow right now, the middle one. Yep. On your lapel, and with your name on it. With your name on it. If you need extras, I have some extras, so just shout out if you need some extras. Your name, and then put it up on your lapel. And all right. All right. All right. right, looking around. Oh, you have actual yellow. You brought your own yellow. I like it. I like it. All right. So at this point, now I have a pretty good sense of where you're kind of starting from, but it doesn't tell me a whole lot of information, right? But really what I'm using it for is for an actual activity. But the challenge here is that I don't necessarily think that we communicated to everybody that there's a device necessary. So we're gonna actually we're gonna look at this activity, we're gonna pretend like we did this activity, we're gonna debrief this activity, and then we're gonna move on. So I'm not gonna actually have you get up and kind of move around the room. And normally in a workshop, I would do that. I would start by actually getting us into a blended and personalized learning experience. But for today, we're gonna kind of just look this over real quick and really kind of think about, you're considering your own individual school or district, all right? Because you can come back to this activity. It might be a really good one for Cajon Valley. I know that you guys are already moving on this stuff pretty significantly. Think about your current initiatives, successes, and challenges. And then you're going to use these resources to come up with what resonates with regard to a personal vision around this work. And so this activity is really more about you kind of personally than even about your work collectively in your schools and districts. And the goal is to really deepen your understanding, because we believe that there is a lot of buzzwords and a lot of kind of like subjective understanding of blended and personalized learning terminology, student-centered terminology, deeper learning terminology, but people really need to get a little bit deeper into, especially in their local context, what are we actually talking about when we say these words? And we want you to experience it. We believe that adult learning must actually go into simulated activities of the tasks that we're interested in having our students participate and learn from, or having our teachers actually run within their own classrooms. It's essential for adults to kind of participate in those activities as well. And so this is an actual activity that we create, that we would run. And so I want you just to take a look at this really quickly and kind of just look across and see, what do you notice? And so instead of actually doing this, which is terrible pedagogy, we're gonna actually just read it, look at it, and then I wanna hear if you notice some things that pop out at you about this task. Let me know what you notice and what you think about. And again, all of these links are live, so you can come back to this at any point on your own. What do you notice about this task? And that's a really general, open-ended question on purpose. We're communicating digitally, so there's an opportunity to think about communication, but not just necessarily having to do it face-to-face, but being able to do it online. That's a good one. Lots of choice, lots of options for students or teachers or adults in this task to be able to kind of choose their own path. You can go at your own pace in this, right? There isn't really a set amount of activities or a set amount of tasks that you must complete. You really can kind of move as you want. The goal obviously is here at the bottom, and so you got to kind of check in with your goal, but ultimately you can kind of go where you need to go. What else? Yeah. Right, so there's opportunities for you to kind of learn and where you're comfortable. And I'm not necessarily talking about comfortable in terms of multiple intelligences or any of that sort of thing, but this is really just I woke up today and I don't really feel like talking to anybody, so I kind of want to just learn by myself, that kind of choice and option, right?
It is empowering the learner.
It's empowering the learner. It's giving the learner the choice to be able to make within their own with their own learning. Take a couple more. Anyone else notice something? Yeah. Yeah, so just thinking about this idea of this as a framework that you don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over, right? So you can obviously put in any number of tasks that would be done face-to-face with somebody, any number of tasks that would get you into a platform where other people are already there, and any number of tasks that you could put any type of content into a playlist format and have people be able to engage in it independently. What else?
4 out of 5 involve other people.
4 out of, yep. So it's kind of almost weighted on this idea that we want you to learn with other people, but if you're just really not feeling it, you got an option. Yep. All right, that's perfect. All right, so just kind of getting you into some of the vibe of what this work is. Let's keep moving. So actually, this was what we just did together. And that was what you would have done. So we're going to talk a little bit about, and I'm not sure why, okay. We're going to talk a little bit about, just to kind of get rooted in some definitions, and these are the 2 that I chose for today. But you can really think about this presentation, this framework, these activities for any lack of a better word, buzzword that you happen to be using in your local context. We want you to be able to kind of not get stuck on the proper nouns here, because we think too often the proper nouns actually derail us in some of this work. So what is this? What are we talking about? Have you guys seen the first, we're just gonna play the first minute of this clip, if you don't mind.
This is America in 1900. This is a car in 1900, and a phone, and a high school. This is America in 1950, and a car, and a phone, and a high school. This is today, a car, a phone, a high school. Whoa, back up. So cars are now this, and phones are now this, but high schools are still that? American high schools are based on the same model, and it's been over 100 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
But why? In 1900, it made sense for high schools to prepare students for that. But in 2018, shouldn't they be preparing students for this, and even this? So why are we still granting diplomas based on the time a student spends in a seat? Why are we still using the Carnegie unit, which was developed in 1906 and says the formula for learning is 4 years sitting at a desk multiplied by one subject taught at a time equals students ready for the future? All questions, execute the super school.
All right, so we'll stop short of the promotional side of this video. But are you guys familiar with XQ and the high school redesign? So this is actually kind of a tired trope in terms of like comparing schools to what they were in the past. We've kind of, I think, beaten almost a dead horse here in terms of this mindset and this logic. But the reason that I wanted to play this video is because I do think that what it frames pretty clearly is a why for change. But what I want to emphasize here is this is one singular why for change, and that once you start to kind of adopt other people's whys for change, it's going to have a different kind of like guttural feeling for each of you in this room. Some of you, this may be the 15th time you've seen this video in 15 different presentations, and you're just kind of like, oh my God, don't play that video again. Some of you, that might have been the very first time you've ever seen that, and you're like, holy crap, I can't believe our classrooms look the same as they did, and the phone and all these different things are changing around it. That's actually a good reminder for me. Whereas some of you might say, well, I teach kindergarten. What does this have to do with me? My classroom looks completely different than anything that it looked like, 20, 30 years ago. So the main reason that I'm playing this is not actually to reinforce any particular direction forward. What I'm playing this for is as you start to think about change, what this workshop and what our framework and what our book is talking a lot about is what we need to do is we need to own the messaging, we need to own the concepts, we need to own this locally. And you need to kind of define for yourselves what these changes are. Now, you can get inspired nationally, you can get ideas nationally, but when you start, if you were to say, walk into your convocation at the beginning of the year and play this XQ video as your way of getting your entire team and staff rallied around some massive change at scale, it's most likely going to be exactly what we noticed in the room here, many different people reacting to it in many different ways, and some people actually saying like, why are you showing, I don't even get why this, how is this relevant to me? So that's really what we're trying to talk about and root this in today is relevance. And so I'm gonna, I can't advance, and I think we just have to click one more time. You just have to maybe hit escape. There you go. And one forward. Let's play the video one more time. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so let's talk about, I'm going to bring my personal take to the table now, okay? Because I think that's another important piece, is that a lot of times when you have actual like folks that do this work across a national scale or across a global scale, they don't often say in a transparent way that this is my personal perspective on this. And I think that this is an important part of this conversation as well, is that people need to own that this is either something that I've borrowed, this is something that I created, or this is something that we collectively, the ideal that we collectively brought together from many different voices in the conversation. So this is the Highlander Institute's take on personalized learning. So I'm just going to go through this in a couple minutes because I think it is important for you to have a sense of where I'm coming from today as I'm talking about the work and change that we do around school change at the Institute. And really where we focus and what we think about foremost at the root of our change efforts is the student experience. And so in our thinking, when we actually are trying to develop and work with schools and districts, we really start at that concept of, well, what are students currently experiencing and what do you want them to be experiencing? And so are you guys, many of you are probably familiar with Jerry Maguire. Okay, so we're gonna play a short clip. This is another clip. This is the last clip, so don't worry, we're not gonna get stuck in clips all day.
Quan, that's your word?
Hell yeah, that's my word. You know, some dudes might have the coin, but they'll never have the quan.
What is...
It means love, respect, community, and the dollars too, the entire package, though. Quan. Great word.
So, the quan. Now, that is something that Rod Tidwell put a lot of thought, a lot of time, a lot of energy into. He actually created his own word just to mean what he needed from Jerry in this particular instance, so that he knew what he was after. And that's really, you know, as an example of what we're trying to get at here from the student experience. We believe that at the local, at the district, even at the state if you need to, but we have to be thinking about what is our own personal quan in this work. And that there are a lot of really great frameworks, and we're gonna share some of them with you today, but that if you are not having those conversations and getting to your own personal quan, then you're not necessarily really getting at, you're not gonna have something that's sticky, you're not gonna have something that's gonna last beyond one particular leader or one set of leaders that are gonna move on eventually. And so here, again, I'm gonna talk, oh, we gotta do escape one more time, whatever you did on that last one. Perfect. So this is our statement. And we've stuck with this statement now for about 5 or 6 years. We're just starting to kind of reinterrogate it to think a little bit more about if we want to expand it or we want to change it. But this is our statement, that if you go to most of our trainings, most of our sessions, you will see this statement. We believe that mastery is the goal, that there are a range of different types of skills and types of qualities that we want in students, competencies, and that they have different degrees of mastery across all of these different competencies, but ultimately at the end of the day, mastery is our goal. And that if mastery is the goal, what we actually are struggling with is that personalization is our challenge. Personalization is not what we're aiming to do. Personalization is actually the challenge that we have. Students are coming in with a range of different needs, whether they be connected to poverty, whether they be connected to a special need, whether they be connected to a life event, whether they be connected to just having some degree a language issue, any number of things that are challenges with regard to how we as the adults have to figure out where that student is coming from and then personalize for them. So it's not that we're attempting to have students master work. We're not attempting to personalize learning. What happens when we, and it sounds like a play on words, it sounds like semantics, sounds like I'm like splitting hairs, but it's important because if we focus on creating personalized learning classrooms, all we're doing is creating a newly disequitable classroom where the children with different needs are still walking into and still struggling in the same ways that they were struggling in the previous classrooms. Now, just by a roll of the dice, you may have nailed something that gets a higher percentage of kids into a place where they feel good, but that's gonna plateau pretty quickly if you're not actually thinking about the personalization challenges that are super specific to your context. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't get to design for what you care about and believe in, your quan, as adults, as communities, as long as you have all the right voices at the table. And so some of those things that we think are important, and we know these because researchers show that they're important, or when they've been done well, we actually see student outcomes improve, or they just make sense within the phases, within the ways that education is broken down. But one of the ways that we think you can personalize is through differentiation, and this is probably the most obvious and probably the most time-tested form of personalized instruction. The idea that if I'm in a core competency, I can differentiate up or down. I can scaffold for students who need support. I can push students who are already doing well and need that extra push. So thinking about differentiating across a core competency up and down, that's actually a really good entry point for folks that are just getting started in this work to also be thinking about how am I taking into account personalization challenges. Secondly, we talk about pacing. Now, pacing is taking this and kind of flipping it this way, right? It's actually taking your structured scope and sequence of content of what needs to be mastered and allowing whether it's content in the cloud and having your assessments in the cloud, or whether it's just having enough adults so you can get to students when they're ready to demonstrate mastery, but that ability to allow students to move at their own pace without having to wait for their peers or without having to wait for the teacher. And then lastly, we can personalize around the idea of student voice, choice, and agency. And this is probably the one that's most difficult for actually getting to strategies and actually getting to resources, and actually, again, that struggle that we face with regard to the buzzwords versus the actual implementation. But this is the one that most people ignore when they start these efforts. And this is probably the one that most people need to start with when they start these efforts. And so this is what we say is you don't need to do all of them. In fact, if you are just getting started in this work and you decide to kind of bite off all of this, you're going to overwhelm people pretty quickly. But it is good to kind of have a sense of what your entry point is. It's good to have a sense of what your quan is in this work as you kind of start and begin to enter these conversations. And then the technology to support that instruction is really the last thing that you're going to be thinking about. Don't ever start with, hey, this is the blended learning model that we're going to scale, or this is the EdTech adaptive software that we're going to build all of our new personalized learning on top of. The technology comes at the end and enables you to actually be able to do things that while you may have wanted to do them before, you weren't able to do them before because there wasn't that ability to kind of actually expand the options and opportunities. Is this making sense so far? Can I keep moving? You guys are in? Okay, I'm seeing some head nods. Okay, good. All right. So I'm actually going to not stop here. Actually, no, let's do this. Let's do a turn and talk. So I just threw a lot of stuff out there. You nodded. So that means you might have something to say about it. Something might be resonating. Something might not be resonating. I would love for you to just kind of like pick a person next to you and turn and talk. What is the most interesting part of that, this shift in kind of instruction? Not necessarily our frame, but kind of this shift in instruction. What part resonates for you? So turn to the person next to you and based off of what you've kind of heard so far, what's resonating with you? Oh, that's actually the wrong spot for that slide. While you're doing that, I'm going to come around and collect your name tags. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Highlander Institute now. And who we are as an organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We're located in Providence, Rhode Island. Been doing this work since about 2011, 2012. We do contract services to schools and districts around the implementation of blended and personalized learning, and we now are moving more and more toward finding aligned partners who really want to do this work over a longer arc of 2 or 3 years and really start to see change at a building level. And so that's kind of the work is now evolving. We had been doing a lot of work where we would go into schools and districts and they would kind of give us a cohort of teachers and we would coach them directly kind of absent of a school change process. So we are moving much more toward the book and the framework in terms of this work. But we also do a lot of grant-funded work within the state that's kind of built around research and development and kind of teacher leadership and capacity building within the state of Rhode Island. And so we have a FUSE fellowship that has been running now for about 5 years and has built pretty much an army of really highly skilled both coaches and change management kind of expertise within the state of Rhode Island. And we're starting to reap those benefits now as we see more and more schools and districts pushing on this work. And then we also do have all of our resources. So everything that's in this slide deck is open source. So you basically can take it. If you give attribution back to the Highlander Institute, you can change it, you can manipulate it, you can do whatever you need with it. We just want our work to kind of get out there and have more and more people using it more and more often. And then lastly, we have a lot of events that we host both locally in Rhode Island, but also nationally now. We have our Blended and Personalized Learning Conference, which just ended Saturday night, which is why I'm like ready for a nap so badly. And then we had to fly out here. But it's a really great event. It happens the first weekend of April every year. We don't have the date yet for next year, but if you are interested, it's a party. And you can ask, some people from Cajon Valley have been there for it. But it's also a really deep educator level implementation event, but also some kind of deeper conversations at the change management level as well. Okay, so that's who we are. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story kind of where we're going to go today. So this is actually a story that I didn't change. I didn't personalize this to the San Diego experience. But one of the things that I think when I think about school change, I think a lot about travel. And especially as somebody that travels a lot between the East Coast and the West Coast for this work, the ease at which I can go from Providence to San Francisco is just mind-blowing to me constantly. And many of you probably had frustrating travel experiences to get here, but even when I'm having frustrating travel experiences, I'm just blown away by how easy it is to go from point A to point B. When you think about this, though, from a school change standpoint or from a redesign standpoint, it's kind of the exact opposite in a lot of ways, because what we have here is we have a nice network of ways in which to get from there to here. I don't even have to take a plane, right? There's train options, there's car options, there's all sorts of options for us. And unfortunately, in the school change work, we don't necessarily have these clear options. In fact, we don't even necessarily have orientation. We don't even know necessarily what's up, what's down, what direction we should be going in. Even more complex and terrifying is that we oftentimes start this work without actually even knowing where we're headed. So imagine, like, I got to get to a conference, but I don't even know where that conference is. And then lastly, and I think the piece that we oftentimes forget, and where we're going to start the conversation today, is that we don't really even know where we're starting from. And so oftentimes we're doing this work in this environment. And this is really where I think why we wrote the book, is because we feel like we were seeing so many people that even though they had a lot of words to describe what it is and what they wanted and where they were going and what they'd done, and when we actually listened closely, you realize that this is where they were at. And so sadly, when that's where you're starting from, this is oftentimes what you default to. You have a general understanding of where you're starting from. You have a general understanding of where you want to go, and you pick a single solution that neither starts from where you are nor gets you to where you want to go. And you kind of put all your eggs into that one basket and really kind of rely upon that to take you there. And I know I'm really probably not supposed to say these things at this particular conference where everybody is pitching their single solution for how to do this work, but it's really true. And unless we start talking about it openly and really acknowledging that your single platform, your single product is not a solution for every single school or every single district in our country, we are wasting a lot of breath, a lot of time, and we're going to really waste a lot of our students' capacities and abilities in this world. And so this is really where we kind of have stepped in to try and figure out a way to build a linear process by which schools and districts can kind of follow these steps in an accountable way, with a little bit of adaptive ability within that, but ultimately wanting to help schools and districts to kind of just think about making their own decisions within this work. And so these are some of the shifts in our model, and I just kind of want to call these out in the beginning, and then we'll have a little bit of time to talk and think about how these resonate to you. So a lot of times when we do these school change efforts, and especially when we start to think about like curriculum design or the state level or all these different pieces, they become top-down efforts. And again, we kind of look for that one silver bullet solution that's going to get us there. What we think we need is much more of kind of bottom-up, top-down together research and development, opportunities where maybe the top finds the options, but it doesn't start implementing them unless there's an opportunity for the bottom to be able to say, hey, this is interesting to me, I'm willing to try that, but if I would try that, I need you to think about these 5 things and we need to do this together. Like, don't ask me to try and pilot something if you're not going to come into my classroom and actually see how it's working. Single solutions. Too often and I get it, budgets are tight, so like you're not going to try 1,000 different things at once. But single solutions have really gotten us very little in terms of outcomes and opportunities for students. We really believe that there have to be multiple opportunities, especially if you're thinking about what we ultimately are looking for is personalized learning for our students. We also need to be thinking about the teachers and the multiple entry points and belief systems and wishes that those teachers have for what they have access to and opportunity to bring to their students. So multiple solutions is really going to be pretty important. This one really gets a lot of people. And we stick to this even though a lot of folks kind of really see this very differently. Many folks, especially superintendents, especially school boards, I just presented at the National School Board Association and a lot of people gave me dirty looks on this one. You oftentimes have to do things at scale. You have to buy things. You have to roll out one-to-one initiatives. And you rationalize this by saying it's equitable. We want everyone to have the same device. We want everybody to have the same high-quality instructional material. We want coherence across our system. I get all of those things, but what you ultimately end up missing out on is people raising their hand to say, that's awesome, how do I get that in my room? And so what we need to be thinking about, and even though I realize there's an urgency to get the best things in front of our teachers and students immediately, we keep defaulting to the urgency in actually sacrificing a longer arc, a longer term opportunity. And so this is where I think a lot of times we go wrong, is by pushing something in that we believe it's good enough. And if we can get enough people, we're aiming for the floor instead of thinking about that aspirational ceiling. Specific mandates, telling people this is what you have to do. I don't know any building principal that loves the job of going in and having to spot check every one of their teachers to make sure they're on module 6.2 as part of their job every day. You're going to send people into their job every day with no passion for this, and it's going to resonate with those students that they don't have any passion for this. And so we need relevant choice across the system. Lastly, our impossibly short time frames for success. This, I get it. We have students that are literally rotting in classrooms today, right now. And I get why in your urgency to reach those kids, you would want to go faster and you would want to see outcomes turn around quicker. And a lot of times those are being forced upon you from the state or from the federal government in ways that you have no control over that conversation. But we have to understand that this is a much longer arc of change, and that if we don't commit to 3, 5, 7 years on one particular change initiative, we're just going to be throwing baby out with bathwater constantly over and over and not actually getting anywhere at the end. And it's not actually going to make it so that those students that we know are struggling actually get what they need faster. We're just kind of tricking ourselves into believing that it is. So why? What are we doing? Ultimately, this is so a lot of those are like reactionary. This is the shift. This is, if you take one thing away from our conversation today, this is the one important thing that we believe. And the book talks about this essentially, is that what we see, and again, going back to that XQ video of the high school change, really what is not the problem is that our classrooms don't look different. What's not the problem is that we can't integrate AI fast enough into our classrooms. Those are not the problem. The problem is that in a world that changes as fast as our world is currently changing, our schools are not nimble enough to do research and development. And so our schools have to develop their own internal mechanisms for whatever is coming down the horizon in terms of opportunities, resources, products, solutions. All of those things need to be able to enter into our system in some logically already predetermined way, be tested, iterated, understand what works and what doesn't work and for who, and then be able to be scaled to the next wave of educators. And that, if we can get to that, if we can get to a place where we actually have the ability in our schools to do R&D quickly, efficiently, and consistently, we think that's actually the shift that needs to happen. It's not about redefining what it looks like between teacher and student. That's always going to be changing. It's about the ability to, when you see something. Yesterday, I was at one of the K12 pitch fests. I was watching my good friend over here, Reza, who's a principal in Rhode Island, Lincoln, Rhode Island, who's doing a lot of this work. But before Reza was a gentleman from Baltimore who has implemented in his school a meditation initiative that is getting incredible results. So here's me at a K12 pitch fest, observing this principal who's doing this work, thinking about all the ranges of like 90 different schools that we're implementing supports in right now, and thinking about how do I get that into that? And the problem, that's the problem. There is no easy way to take that information that I just got, be able to bring it directly to a team of teachers to say, this worked here. I need you to try it and see how it works here. And if there are pieces that work here, we're going to know it quickly, and then we can bring it to the rest of our entire staff and faculty. We have no system to do that. That is the work that must be done. All right. This is our framework for how you go at this. I'm not going to go into this because it's a lot of words, and I've already said a lot of words. But it's in this book, and we're going to raffle a couple today. And if you want it, it's on sale in the bookstore, and I'm happy to help you think through how to do that. But what I want to talk about right now is I want to start at the beginning phases of the framework and talk a little bit about the work that gets us to that R&D engine. And so, going back to our analogy of the cross-country travel, where are we now? Where are we starting from? And so one of the things that we believe is you have to deeply understand your school before you start to think about any sort of change process. And so some of the things that we look for in those early phases is we want to build a team that's representative of all voices across the system. We'll talk a little bit more about the design team in a minute. I'm going to just put that there as kind of a placeholder. The other piece is we have to deeply, and this is why we do that, we started the day with, well, we pretended to start the day with a blended and personalized learning experience. We have, all the people that are on that team have to start understanding what it is that we're actually talking about. We've got to become way more objective about some of our terminology. We've got to become way more intentional about how we're using some of these words. And everybody around the table has to have, we actually have glossaries that we'll put up in principals' offices of some of these buzzwords so that people, when they hear them, can return to it. Because if you're thinking about voice across a system, that means families, that means students, that means community members. And a lot of them don't use the buzzwords and lingo that we use. And so we have to be able to kind of get to a place where all these words and all this language actually makes sense. We have to study our local conditions. And this really is about understanding in the current context, who is our school currently working for? So what subgroups are actually successful? What subgroups are struggling? You can look into your outcomes data to see that. You can look at your attendance. You can look at your student referrals. You can look at your actual performance metrics. But you can also think about surveys and other ways that we talk about, and we'll talk about a little more about that as we go. Lastly, and most importantly, getting back to that student experience, every single member of that design team, anybody that's going to be involved in that change effort, in order to know where you are starting from, you have to walk in the shoes of students. And not just your highest performing students in your highest performing school. You need to be walking in the shoes of your students that are struggling based off of what you see when you start to study those local conditions. And really deeply understand what are they going through in terms of their behaviors every single day in the classroom. You want to, and ideally, you would do this, meet them at their house when they get on the bus in the morning, but I know that's tough. So at least do 4 hours of a student shadow where and there's all sorts of resources at the at IDEO's Shadow a Student website. It literally walks you through step by step how to do this. We did not invent this. We just highly advocate for this as before you even start your redesign options. And then we talk about where are we going, okay? And with where are we going, we have to know where our intention is, right? And we talked about what personalized learning is the student experience. But the real piece here is that it's a shift, not from what is the answer to what is our answer. And so that really is meant to kind of root your conversation in the people that are in your community. What is their answer? Now, that doesn't mean that you have to start from scratch every single time. There's a lot of great resources out there that you can go to. And we actually have on our Pathways to Personalization website at this phase of the framework, and when we're starting chapter 3, if you look at the resources, it's pathwaystopersonalization.com under chapter 3, we have a range of national resources that we've already curated for design teams when they sit down to start with. But the core piece here is that you're not just adopting LEAP's framework. You're not just taking Transcend's work. You are reading it, you're understanding it, but then you're figuring out how to localize it. And so we start this process by basically, if you think about kind of like a funnel, just going deeper and deeper and deeper into a clearer and clearer articulation of what the change effort is actually going to be about. Because at the end of the day, who implements the change effort? Teachers. And so the teachers have to understand what they're being asked to do, or the teachers need to see it very clearly that they were involved in determining what it is that you're going to do, or they need to be able to have a range of options and raise their hand and say, that's the one I want to do. But if they can't articulate it, if they can't identify it, then you haven't done your job of getting it granular enough. And so this is how we do this. We start aspirational. We start by just creating the language that we believe in. And it's based off of, again, where are we now? All of our shadows, all of our subgroup data, all those pieces. We kind of put up a very aspirational vision. Now, this is the piece that's super important. Many of you have a vision statement already for your districts. It probably sits on a wall somewhere in some office of some building. Nobody looks at it. Nobody talks about it. It comes out once a year for convocation. But that is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about taking that down and replacing that, because in order to do that, you're going to get need a whole lot of buy-in that you don't have at the early stages of this. This is just a vision for this pilot at this particular building or at these couple buildings. And so drop the intensity of it. It's really just about what does this group around this table believe this change should focus on. And then from there, we actually select our priority practices. And so we have a priority practices tool that's a research-backed kind of like walk-through observation tool. We use this when we work with schools and districts to help them kind of get to a place where, okay, you got this big aspirational vision, well, what are the actual practices that we're going to start with? And so we work off of this tool to get started in that work. But you can work off of any tool or any walkthrough that you have currently within your district. It doesn't have to be ours. It's really just about getting further and further in terms of articulation. And then we brainstorm instructional strategies and resources that would be able to support those practices that we selected. And only then do we start to actually think about, in collaboration with teachers, what are the entry points for that pilot process, okay? I'm going really fast, but we're going to come back to all of these and kind of get a little bit deeper as we go through the course of the today. And then how do we get there? So this is kind of an important piece for where really a lot of these school change efforts kind of fall apart. Is that it's really, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's many people do readiness data collection. Many people design for change. But the actual implementation is really where it all starts to get really hairy and really messy. And I'm not saying that we've figured out every aspect of this work, but I think we have a pretty clean and clear process that you can follow and again, developing your R&D engine, this you just get better at over time. And so we like to use and think a lot about Rogers' innovation curve. How many folks in the room are familiar with Rogers' innovation curve? Okay. For those of you that aren't, it's a curve that was really designed more for technology adoption, all right? So at the very end over here, you see these innovators. That's like the 2.5% of the society that sleeps out at the Apple store before the release of the next iPhone. And they're the ones that don't really care about if it's proven or if it's going to work or if it's going to like have bugs. They don't care. They just need the new thing, and they need to constantly be changing and changing and changing. Those are not the people to build your change efforts around. They're great, and you don't want to squash them because they're probably the ones that if you ask any student in your school who your favorite teacher is, it's probably that crazy guy that brings a different thing in every single day. They may not be learning anything, but but that's probably what they're excited about. And so, but you don't want to build a change effort around them. Instead, you want to focus on the early adopters. Because the early adopters are the ones that will take on change initiative, they will take on a new idea, without a lot of proof that it works, but they also will have a why behind why they think it's a really good idea. And so that's a pretty good, important distinction there, is that they can see the value, they don't need proof, and most often, they're willing to tolerate a small degree of risk. And that's an important kind of cocktail there for rooting your change initiative. Most of the time, as an organization that does blended and personalized learning implementation supports, when we go into a school or district, folks are giving us people at the absolute opposite end because they're saying, these guys don't want to do any change, convince them to do the change. And we end up spending lots of people's time and lots of people's money and fail every single time because we don't have any proof that these practices work. And a lot of times, these are actually good teachers. In some ways, they're getting some degree of results with kids. They've had good years. They've maybe had some bad years, but this is not a scale that says good teachers over here, bad teachers over here. Good quality instruction goes across the board here. This is about your tolerance for change. And so what we've noticed as we've done this work is that oftentimes people want to start there. This is where you have to start. And what we've also noticed, and you, I guarantee, have probably noticed this as well, is that the gap or the chasm between those early adopters and the early majority who are curious, they're interested, but they need some sort of proof that this works. They need some sort of scaffolding to help them actually take this and run with it, is immense. And Jeffrey Moore writes about this in regards to technology adoption, but we actually see this in the education space as well. How many folks have what you call model classrooms? We call them lighthouse classrooms. You've got amazing, perfectly run articulations of this work happening in individual classrooms, and you just can't figure out how to get the rest of the teachers to do it. Raise your hand if you've seen that. Yeah, there hasn't been a room I've been in where that's not the case. That is where we're at actually nationally. We've got some incredible examples in small pockets in individual schools, and we've got nobody that knows how to actually cross the chasm to get the next wave engaged and interested. And so in the book, what we talk about is this idea of building a rope bridge across the chasm through very specific steps and actions, and then thinking about how that initial kind of entry point actually begins to spread and scale throughout the entire system. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. All right, so I just said a ton of words, like a ton of words, to the point that I need some water. So what we're going to do right now is I want to know, based off of all of that, what about this theory makes sense and what about this theory doesn't make sense to you personally. Don't think about your district or your building or whatever right now. Think about you personally. What parts of it resonated the most? What parts of it actually kind of you're like, I think he's full of it. Like what parts of it were like on either side of that? So go back to your same turn and talk partner and let's go into this based off of the last 10 or 15 slides that we just went through. All right, let's bring it back. I'm really curious, what did you, and then I'm not gonna have, the second question is more for you to kind of like personally just kind of reflect on, not gonna make you say it out loud, not gonna make you share it with your partner, but just kind of personally think about where are you, based off of what you kind of believe or didn't believe about this, where are you actually at with regard to this work? And what I would love to hear is I would love to hear what are some of the things that resonate, what are some of the things that don't really quite make sense yet, and feel free. I'm not gonna. Yeah, I would love to hear. I'm just really curious to hear what folks are thinking. So, based off of that, anyone have anything that kind of came out of their conversation? Yeah.
We could immediately point to several initiatives in our district, some that we've done poorly and some that we are currently doing well.
Yeah.
And when you do it poorly, you make good people hate good ideas, which is a bad thing.
Yes. When you do it poorly, you make good people hate bad. Wait. Make good people hate good ideas. I like that. That's really good. I like that. Any others? Yeah.
We talked about this, the first slide, I guess, about building the design team.
Yeah.
Developing, we're all district coordinators.
Yep.
And we feel like everyone's trying to do the right thing, but once you split out into 16 different schools.
Yeah.
So we really appreciated the studying your local.
Yeah.
Conditions, and then brainstorming ways to keep all of that true.
Yep.
But also keep working towards the same goal.
No, totally. Yeah. That coherence piece, once you start to really uber localize, is tough. Yeah. But that's why a bit, and exactly, that's the key, right? Is you're showing that there's the value in that. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of like what constitutes a design team. And so having actual district representation on every single design team, while that capacity-wise is very difficult, you don't run them all at the same time. It's essential. And we'll talk about why it's essential in a little bit for a couple reasons. Yeah.
I think something that really clicked for me was this idea of R&D being built into the DNA of a school, but I think it actually applies outward too, right?
Yeah.
So we think about like the Netflix and Blockbuster example.
Yep.
Right? Like Netflix was built on this idea we're going to use data,
yep.
respond every quarter, whatever it might be, and I think it makes me reflect on our schools and districts currently designed with that in their DNA.
Yeah.
And if not, how do we get there?
Yeah. And totally. And there's a lot of systems level pieces to this too that actually preclude schools from getting to that in terms of the ways in which you might build this really powerful R&D engine around certain outcomes and then have those outcomes shifted on you almost immediately, right? Netflix doesn't have that. Netflix their outcome is always the same outcome. It's make money. And so we are in a different position oftentimes in education where the pendulum swings back and forth about what matters. And so that's really where, some of the systems level pieces are also at play here. So I'm not just trying to victim blame here to say schools are silly for not being this way. There's reasons they're not this way.
We're just saying like if there is like the early adopters can show some of the results, whether it's student results saying I have, or the data of Lexile scores going up, or whatever it might be because the work is happening.
Yeah.
That's the reason you pull those other people across.
Totally. Building that data story is actually one of the things we talk about for getting you across that chasm, for sure. Any things that didn't resonate? Any things you want to push on a little bit? All right. So normally when we do this, we have a little bit more time. I thought we would be able to have a little bit of time, but then they told me that we're recording. And so it's not great TV to do like deep simulated conversations at tables. So I'm wondering, but I'm willing to do it if you want to do it. Would you guys rather, I guess we'll do it like just as a vote. Would you rather go deep into like some of this work kind of in more of a simulated way? So there's these tasks that we have. Or would you rather kind of like continue to go through the content of the framework and kind of hear more kind of like further along where we're going and go a little bit deeper that way? So we can go deeper in terms of like experiential, or we can go deeper in terms of content. Let's say, who wants experiential? Raise your hand. You are all so lazy. I'm just kidding. You want me to do the work.
Is the content available somewhere else?
Everything's available everywhere. Yeah. You vote for experiential.
If we experience, will we also get through all the content?
No.
I think content.
Okay, well, it seems like that's definitely the content. Raise your hand. All right. Okay, we'll sit and get today, and then we'll do the experiential at another time. And I'll just keep pounding water. So what I want to talk about when we think, so we're going to go through these phases one more time now, a little bit deeper. And I will actually unpack the simulations, because these are things you have all this information now to be able to do this in your local context if you want to do these experiential pieces yourselves. So one of the key pieces to knowing where you are is really thinking clearly about what you actually have access to with regards to data. And so we use the Carnegie Foundation's PDSA model for kind of thinking about a family of measures, because one of the things that really kind of hindered our ability to do this work early on is that we were looking very narrowly at what signaled success in our pilots. And that signal of success was really one of two things, and they kind of sat separately, and we never really were able to figure out how to bring them together. Did we observe change happening, and were outcomes on interim assessments kind of going up? And so those were the really narrow ways that we were thinking about this work, until we found the Carnegie Foundation's kind of model for thinking about this from a family of measures. And so how many folks are familiar with this framework? Okay, so I'm going to go take a little bit of time on this. So this, again, goes back to the design team, goes back to your local conditions, but when we're getting started, we think about this in terms of like, what do we already have access to, and how do we actually know what our starting point is? Both from an asset side, we don't just want to think about ourselves like what's broken, but also thinking about where are the gaps and where are students actually struggling. And so when we think about this, we think about it in terms of three types of measures. The first one is a process measure, and it really is about what's currently happening in our classroom. So that is the student shadow, but it's also kind of more of like a walkthrough and observational data collection. So getting into classrooms, using whether you use a Danielson framework or whatever your evaluation framework is, you can use that. You can use our walkthrough tool. There are a range of ways of thinking about it. You can just take low inference notes. You can do rounds if you do instructional rounds in your district or schools. But just getting to a place where you deeply have observed what practice looks like, and you can speak to it in this level. Then there's the outcome measure, and this is probably the place where you have the most coherence, but probably are also pretty frustrated because you don't think like what change we're actually attempting to do, this outcome measure probably doesn't actually measure that change in the way that's really satisfying. But it is important to know what you currently have access to. So it might be your attendance data, it might be your referral data, it might be your interim assessment data, but it might be something like your grades, or it might be something like your anything. It could be anything in terms of like what it is right now that tells you who is and who isn't doing well academically within your system. The last one, and this is the one that really gets ignored, is the balance measure. And the balance measure is, are we having any unintended consequences for our stakeholders? And so that is surveys, it's focus groups, it's one-on-one interviews, it's student cogens. I don't know if you've read Chris Emden's book, but he has this way of teachers kind of bringing students together and having informal conversations with them to just be able to get at the actual ability of them to self-identify and identify for you where the assets, strengths, and gaps are for your particular starting point. This is how you want to we believe that ultimately you have to kind of sit in this middle of these three, because if you have two of them doing really well but your students are miserable, what are you doing? That's the opposite of that quan, right? If you have your students are super happy but your outcome measures aren't going anywhere, you got great engagement, but you've got low expectations. And so you really have, it's all three of the legs of this stool that must come together in this work. This was the simulated activity that we're going to do. We're going to actually look at some process outcome and balance measure data for two particular schools. And so you can get that data packet online. It's also a couple of them I left on the tables. And then there's actually a template provided for being able to think about what do you notice. But ultimately in this simulation, what you would have done is you would have analyzed these two schools side by side, and you would have thought about where are the strengths and where the challenges in terms of helping you come to a consensus around which school would be the right school to start with for this work. Because you can't do every single school across your district at the same time in this work. It's deep, deep work. And so you have to kind of think about, well, what are some of the indicators that would tell us this is the place to start? And so that kind of goes to your question about this work at the district level. All right, we're going to skip this too. So this is important. Who will lead this work? We have spent a lot of time thinking about this particular question. Oftentimes when we have done our change efforts in the past, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we'll have a point person, right? And that concept of point person is, okay, Highlander Institute, you come in at the CAO level, the Chief Academic Officer, maybe it's at the building leader level, and say, all right, this is your school that we're going to give you, regardless of any levels of understanding, and most often it's the struggling school, because that's the one that has the school improvement funding. And in that school, these are the teachers. It's a grade level team because they have the same common planning time, even though 4 of those teachers are retiring in 2 years, and the other 2 are first years that can't even balance this load. And those are the ones you're going to change immediately, but they have the same common planning time, so that's the schedule. Those are the teachers. Go make change. That's how it's been in the past. That's not the people we're looking for to lead this change. What we need in this change is we need what we call a lead change agent. And a lead change agent is probably one of your most dynamic people that you have within your system, who both is able to kind of build consensus, but also able to facilitate and has a strong commitment to the accountability across that long arc of change. Now that can be a building leader, right? So Reza is the lead change agent in his building. He's driving this change and doing it in addition to the many other tasks that he has to do as a building leader. So it's possible. Sometimes it's a coach. It may be a district level coach. It may be a building level coach. Sometimes it can actually be a teacher, but you have to think about how are you going to provide extra opportunities for that teacher to have the time they need in their schedule to be able to manage the workload associated with this effort. So, that's how we think about it. But oftentimes, if you have, so like in one of the schools we work in, the way they have it is they have each elementary building has a math and an ELA coach, and so they do it together. And so they kind of like deputize each other to do different parts of the process. So you can think about it as multiple people or as singular people. It's not a team though, because it's got to be the point. Like they are the ones that basically are on the hook for driving this effort forward. Then you want the design team, and the design team it looks a little bit like this. It's got to have representation from across the entire system. you have to have district leadership on the design team. What we're going to talk about in a little bit is we're going to get into all the barriers and all the challenges that are preventing change from happening. If you're having all these conversations around the table and there's nobody there from the district to hear it firsthand, bring it back and kind of discuss where these change efforts need to happen, it's gonna your effort's not going anywhere. On the flip side of that, you don't just want district and building level leadership designing the change either. We've got to have community voice at the table. We've got to have parent voice at the table. We've got to have student voice at the table. We ran a design team meeting about this time last year, where we did the student shadows, and we had 2 parents on the design team that actually did those shadows with us, as we recommend. And the parents, we came back together to start that vision for the pilot. And we came up with a really nice vision for the pilot, and then we started to get into the priority practices, and the teachers were really excited about the idea of students progressing at mastery, like just being able to kind of move at their own pace and progress at mastery. And one of the parents kind of spoke up and said, you know, I'm a little bit worried because I'm not, based off of what I saw in the classrooms and based off of like my daughter being here a couple years, I'm not exactly sure that all of your teachers really know what mastery looks like in terms of all these concepts. Now, there were other teachers at that table that she was saying this in front of, but so this lead change agent had to actually create an environment where there was safe enough for that parent to say that. We went a little bit further, we kind of talked a little bit more, and what we got to was at the root cause of some of the other pieces that came out of this design team meeting. It was a really fascinating design team meeting. Another parent, who's a parent of a student of color in the building, a Latinx woman, student that is not a dual language student, but actually speaks English really well and is at the top of her class. But the parent knows the struggles and was observing a teacher who was actually berating a student in a class for what she felt was a non-compliance issue, but the parent noticed that it was actually a language issue. And so the parent brought that into that conversation as well and said, I think also what I'm noticing in your classrooms when I do the shadow, and the shadow is really about the student experience. It's not about so we didn't even bring that teacher's name up. That teacher wasn't in the room. It wasn't about that teacher. What it was about is that there was a certain lack of cultural competency that was apparent within that building. And this was that opportunity for the parent to kind of put the brakes on. Let's not develop a fully paced model around a scope and sequence of curriculum. Let's focus on cultural competency and getting our teachers to more deeply understand mastery as a baseline, and then we can kind of build on that. And so that tension, but also that opportunity really, really roots that parent community in the change effort. Because all it then took was us to acknowledge that and change the priority practices that we put down there. And now as we're continuing to go through implementation this year, that parent has been one of the most active members of that team. When she goes through the classrooms, she's actually doing walkthroughs with administration, and now she's recruiting additional parents into the community, into the redesign efforts. And so that's really, when we talk about stickiness, that's the moment when stickiness starts. When you bring these other members of your community into that conversation, no matter how difficult it is, that's actually what you're building. Is you're building an anchor that's going to put that into the community in a way that's going to last beyond if that principal leaves, beyond if that district leadership leaves. And then lastly, we have a whole chapter dedicated to this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but pilot teachers. These are basically the people that are going to carry the water of your change effort. These are the people that you're developing into your R&D engine. Because these folks are not going to just do this once. They're going to get hooked. This becomes almost like a drug for them, where the idea of being able to take in new ideas, determine what works, have a team of people that are really, truly interested in their opinions about what works and doesn't work, people that are giving them coaching to help figure out what works, they're going to not just do that once, they're going to do that for forever. And so that's really what we're building here, is we're building that competency in those people. And so there's certain qualities and certain mindsets and certain competencies that we call out. We really heavily lean on the Ina blended learning teacher competencies. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that framework. It's been out for about 5 years now, but it's a really solid framework for thinking about teacher competencies for change. And so that's a really core piece of this effort as well. And they come into that team together. I talked a little bit about this, the stakeholder voice and why in my example, so I'm going to kind of skip through this. But just know that it's not just about checking a box when you bring families and community members to the table. You're actually increasing the knowledge base that you have at the table. You're acknowledging that the folks that are around that table have bias, and that bias can play itself out in your redesign efforts as much as it can play itself out in your daily, legacy efforts. And so you have to kind of be open and understanding of that. And it really helps to, again, root that change over time. KnowledgeWorks has a pretty good kind of framework for thinking about how do you bring more people into that conversation. But that's also a place where we're developing a lot of resources right now, so stay tuned. We're going to have whole kind of resource packets for how do you recruit, retain, and engage in an ongoing way families, communities around this work. All right. So this would be the second simulation now, where we would dive into the priority practices a little bit deeper, and you would actually be a design team who has created, we would give you a kind of a fake vision for a pilot, and then you would actually, as a group, sit around the table and determine which priority practices you think are the right priority practices for this particular school or building. And so this is that second simulation that we're gonna skip through, but if you want to return to it, this is the link to the priority practices tool that's on your table. So if you want a digital copy of this, this slide is the one that has the link to that, okay? And what's really cool when you do this, if you do come back to this, is that what we've actually created are role cards. So if we did this activity with you, we would have each of you, we would have 9 role cards, and each of you would take one of those. So I'm a student who believes X, Y, and Z. I'm a parent who is looking for this. I'm a teacher that feels this. I'm an administrator that wants this. And so those role cards, you kind of adopt that in a simulated manner, and then you get into the priority practices and kind of actually have to kind of advocate for the different practices based off of kind of where you're coming from in this work. This is that mock vision statement we would have used. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what it looks like in actual reality before you get started in the implementation effort. So what should come out of those first, and we in the book say 3 to 4 initial 90-minute meetings with the design team is what actually takes you from student shadows, experiencing kind of that where are we now, into an actual articulated description of what it is that teachers should be doing, pilot teachers should be doing in classrooms to actually operationalize this. And so it looks a little bit like this. You design that vision. That's kind of the first meeting. You take all that information from the student shadows, all that student subgroup information, all of the conversations that you've had with families around the focus groups and the surveys, and you create a vision. Then you select, we like to try and keep it at 3 priority practices because we think that gives at least pilot teachers some degree of choice in where they get started, but it also isn't overwhelming. We had one design team that had 8 priority practices, and we were looking at having to collect data against all 8 of them, and the teachers having to get coached against all 8 of them, and we noticed that 3 of them that we weren't even really touching yet, and so we kind of truncated back to 4 and felt like 4 was the right number for that particular design team. And then from the priority practices, then you have to kind of brainstorm some specific strategies for entry points. And this is where the coaching becomes necessary, because not all of your pilot teachers are going to know how to do all of these things. And so coaching within this model is key. And so again, from a capacity standpoint, if you're district level folks, you want to be thinking about how many actual buildings could we do this level of deep coaching in. When we do this work, we at least have a full day in a building a week, so that we know that if it's 3 pilot teachers or it's 4 pilot teachers, that every single week, every single one of them is going to have at least some point in time with the coach to kind of debrief or kind of push forward. Because if you're really trying to accelerate these pilot classrooms as your R&D labs, you're going to need that opportunity. And in those environments where we are able to get to that point in time, we kind of look at it as like the pilot teacher is like the egg, and the design team is like this nest. And you got to build this nest around them. So if you don't have coaches that can do that coaching, then somebody on that design team needs to be able to kind of step up at least to be a thought partner for those teachers. Because just kind of getting to here and then saying, go get them teachers, is not necessarily going to get you where you need to go either. And so really thinking about, no R&D engine is going to develop independently of expertise. And so some degree of expertise has to be there to push on this work. All right, so now we're going to talk about once our pilots are running and they're moving. Remember we talked about that chasm, and we talked about how do we get across that chasm. And so how do we build that initial rope bridge from these pilots to the next tiers of teachers? Because ultimately, every word I've said prior to this in terms of the where are we now and where are we going is really only building a foundation. This is the part that everybody is stuck on and struggling with, is like the scaling mechanism. And so we feel like if we just keep building foundations and we don't actually think about this, then we're not actually doing the R&D engine. We're developing it, but we're never actually getting to the place where anybody can watch their Netflix from any room in any place around the country, right? We got to get it so that every single kid's experience is changing for the better. And so this is the piece that we're talking about there. And so you mentioned the data story. And that is the number one piece. As you are collecting that process, that outcome, and that balance measure data, remember we talked about the observable, the academic, or the outcomes that we care about, and the balance measure, the conversations with the stakeholders. That's going to become your data story. That's going to become the rationale for the next wave of teachers as to why. And oftentimes what we see that in this early majority here, they're kind of curious. They're kind of like, they're looking at their teacher next door and they're saying like, what are you doing? What's that coach working with you on over there? And so oftentimes you can start to scale some strategies across that bridge relatively quickly. And so the data story may not be necessary for some of these very first folks, but if you don't get that curiosity coming, if you don't get those people that are poking their heads up, then that's where the data story becomes even more important, because that's the rationale for change. If you're getting better outcomes in your pilot classrooms than you're getting in your control classrooms across any metric that you as leaders deem to be important, or you as a design team or community deem to be important, then people on the other side damn well better care about that. Because they can't ignore that this is better for students according to the parents, according to the students, according to the outcomes, or according to the observable behaviors that we're seeing when we walk through the classroom. They can't ignore that. And so then that just becomes kind of like your own ability to communicate that. We talk a little bit about that in the book later in chapter 8 and 9. This is the part that is essential and really difficult. But again, if you build that nest and you have a really strong and high-functioning design team, and again, you don't think about how this has to happen immediately, but this can kind of happen over time. One of the challenges we think, or not think, we know, the main challenge here is that a lot of the teachers on that side of the chasm, really, if we think about our classrooms too, it's not that they don't want to do it. Maybe some of them don't want to do it, maybe later on in the curve, but we haven't actually built the scaffolding for them to access it. They see these massive strategies that you're doing. Like we have a classroom right now where they're doing choice boards where individual students are basically like, know that they have to get through these, and this is first grade, they have to get through these 10 tasks by the end of the week and demonstrate mastery in these different ways, and they're basically managing that on their own kind of like piece of paper at a weekly basis. You want to walk into that classroom, and we bring people through that classroom a lot because it's one of the pilot classrooms. You would be, as a teacher, you'd be like, and you're like, look at this, isn't it amazing? And they're getting good results, and they're getting good this, and they're getting good that. Do this. That's oftentimes what we say to teachers is, isn't this great? And they're like, yeah, this is great. And they're like, do this. You got to deconstruct that for them. You have to actually break that down into what are the initial strategies that laid the foundation at the beginning of the year. It's now April. You want me to get that up and running in April? Like, what would be the first step? What would be the second step? What would be the third step? And so implementation pathways are the place to document all of that. You're like a squirrel gathering nuts before winter. You're like running through these classrooms saying like, that collaboration protocol, I need it. You're taking photos of the growth mindset bulletin board that the teacher created. You're filming the teacher as she introduces on Monday how the choice board is meant to be used in the classroom. You're videotaping students having accountable talk in the collaborative center because that's an example of what is high quality, so now that the next teacher knows what to be looking for. So implementation pathways are essentially aligned to the priority practices. They have very specific strategies, but they need to be very visual. The more video you can collect, the better. The more tangible, actual like hyperlinks to the places where these teachers are going to get their tasks, or places where teachers are building their Google Docs, or places where teachers are launching these things, you have to actually have very specific ways. And then, once you have those, then the teachers on the other side can say, that looks really cool, I want to try that, coach me in that. And now that's scalable professional learning. Because now it's not about you saying, we're going to get every single classroom replicated to look exactly like this first grade classroom. What you're saying is, there are so many amazing things happening in this first grade classroom, choose one. Choose one that we're going to coach you on next year, or choose one that you're going to focus on over the summer and begin to implement in the fall. There's a famous, there's a professor that we quote in the book whose name I never remember, which is just a terrible thing. But he talks about how basically, he's in teacher prep, and he's done research that says, like, you can essentially you can't expect a teacher to change more than about 10% of their practice a year. But you also should expect that they change at least 10% of their practice every year. So, like, if you're thinking about that, you have these early adopters that are changing just about everything within 1 year. Don't expect that everyone is going to go at that same pace. Think about how are you deconstructing, think about how are you building choice, think about how are you creating opportunities for ways in which those teachers can then start small but accelerate over time. And if you're doing that balance measure data collection, you're not just doing it with your students, you're not just doing it with your parents, you're also doing it with those pilot teachers. Because those pilot teachers will be able to tell you which of the practices that they're doing are having the highest leverage for which kids. They will notice that. They will understand that. And so you can even, in the implementation pathways, prioritize. These are high leverage practices that are going to be really good for your dual language learners. These are high level practices that are going to be really good for your students that seem disengaged. These are high, and those teachers then have a little bit more clarity and understanding of which ones to kind of volunteer and say, coach me on that, teach me on that. How do I do that? Give me that implementation pathway. The last one is kind of like the flip side of all of this, is barrier mapping. So one of the things that your pilot teachers, as they go through these efforts, and as you have your midpoint kind of check-in meetings with your full design team, is you're not just want to looking at that process, outcome, and balance measure, but you also want to collect some qualitative conversational notes from the teachers about what barriers are you running into, right? We have one particular school that we're working in where, you know, the district leadership, even the building leadership, they talked really deeply and highly aspirational about like the changes they wanted. They talked about personalized learning. They had all the right buzzwords. But then what it came down to, they actually made, they said because the state test is so big in Rhode Island right now, I know it's big everywhere, but it's really high stakes right now in Rhode Island. And they were like, at the last minute, everyone needs to be at module 6 before the test in Eureka Math. Now here's a pilot teacher that all year long has been kind of encouraged to be out in front and trying new things and doing all this work and thinking about pace and thinking about all these pieces. And then it's announced globally across the school building and across the district, module 6 by the test. And so she just broke into tears and just like nobody thought about like how would that actually impact or affect her. She's a very much a want to please, want to do well kind of a person, and it almost broke her. And so you have to be really, really mindful of the barriers that you're putting in place. and be thoughtful about how you're actually protecting your pilot teachers, again, that nest concept, from those barriers, but also encouraging them to be transparently sharing with the design team what the barriers are when they notice them. Because if those barriers aren't surfaced, as you start to cross the chasm, these folks are not going to persevere through them. These folks might. She's still going to do it. There's no way she's not going to still be back at it again on Monday. Like that teacher, she broke down crying, but she was just like giving birds to the district leadership and went right back at it. Like, damn it. But those folks on the other side will not. And they will see the disingenuous nature of what you're asking them to do. They will see those barriers as giant red flags in front of them. And so when we think about barriers, well, this is that. I already talked a little bit about this, so I'll bop through. We think about, these are examples of process outcome balance measures. This is an example of an implementation pathway. These are the way we kind of organize these barriers. And we think that it's important to have a framework for how you kind of organize and talk about the barriers. We use this Innovation Scaling for Impact by Meyer and Silos for two reasons. First of all, in their research, Meyer and Silos have found that while these are pretty significant barriers, the idea of economic barriers, resource allocation, we've got some really lean schools that are able to do this on pretty lean budgets. It's not right, it shouldn't be that way, but they are. You can make it work. Knowledge and skills, you can always increase your knowledge and skills. And if you really are thinking about the long arc of change, that's essentially what the long arc of change is growing your knowledge and skills over time. But legacy systems and power, those are huge. And so being able to kind of take qualitative feedback from those pilot teachers and sort it into which of these buckets it really is about, it not only helps you think about which ones are really we can overcome probably through conversations at the design team level, which ones do we need to be super thoughtful about who's at the table when we have those conversations, because otherwise we're just spinning our wheels. And that's a lot of times what happens, is that there are people that either have power, that aren't going to give up that power within the system, and we're talking about them when they're not there, and we're basically just becomes a waste of time and a waste of energy because we're just going in circles. So that if we know that this is a power issue, then we can be strategic about thinking how we go after the power issue. If we know it's a legacy issue, our buses just run that way, and so that determines our start time. Our start time determines our CPT. Our CPT, all of these things kind of like go back to, like, if it's a legacy issue, could we think about how we might be able to change that legacy issue? These are bigger conversations than design team conversations. The design team is meant to surface them within the system, but you're going to need to go to that district level. You're going to need to maybe go to that school board level. You're going to need to go to maybe that mayoral level in some ways to start to think about, if you really want to see this change happen, these are some of the things that are going to need to move. These are some of the things that are going to need to shift and have really open conversations with the people that actually have that power. Otherwise, it's just victim blaming. If you get to a point where you basically are saying like, well, we realize that what we need to do is actually being hindered by this thing, and that's what we do now, what's the easiest place to go and shift the blame? You say, oh, well, the teachers won't change. Oh, these students can't do it. These students aren't the right students to do this type of work. When really, ultimately, we have gone through this entire piloting process, and we're at the point where we're ready to cross this chasm, but this barrier is still in the way. And so that's an important component, is to be able to really kind of be collecting that barrier information as you go. All right. I think we're coming up on time, right? What are we doing? Yeah, we've got about 15 more minutes, 13 more minutes, 11:50, right? Yeah. So I really want to just make sure that at the end here, we have some time for questions. I also just want to let you know, we've got a book signing today at 2. You can get this in the marketplace downstairs, but also can get it online. And then if you're interested in working with us, we have a lead change agent workshop where because right today, this was just kind of like a high level of like kind of like what our change theories are about. But if you actually want to learn like more deeply how to do this, lead change agents are key, but lead change agents are kind of unicorns. And so people need to be supported to be lead change agents. Like there aren't a lot of people that have all the skill sets to do all the things that I just mentioned. So that's a place that we really help support that initial kind of, and then we build it around a gradual release model of giving the lead change agent those skills so that they can then start to actually take on more and more of that work independently. Or if you're interested in kind of partnering with us in a larger capacity because you don't have the capacity to kind of do all these different pieces, this is the person on our team that handles all of that work as well.
Does that cost?
It is. It's $1,000 a person, and it's in Providence. Yeah, you have to be in Providence. We are looking at models where we could come out and do lead change agent, so that would also go through Kara, if you're interested.
And then you also mentioned student coaching. There's a researcher who did.
Yeah, well, so Chris Emden wrote a book called For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood. And in that book, he comes up, he has an incredible model for balance measure, basically. It's an unbelievable way of kind of, almost like a framework in some ways, of being able to kind of get students to more deeply open up and engage about their experience in the classroom. And if you're doing change efforts and you need that balance measure, you need that feedback from students in a continuing basis, it's just another model for being able to think about that. All right, any thoughts or questions, ways you want to kind of like localize this to your context, things you want to throw out that, that were interesting, questions you have about the simulations that we didn't get to. Let's just open it up for like the next 10 minutes or so to any thoughts or questions you have.
Blended Learning Teacher Networks, I'll go. I had a few.
Yeah.
Frameworks. Where were the frameworks?
Yeah, so the Pathways to Personalization.com website is actually broken up by chapter. And in chapter 3, we talk about all the different kind of like knowledge building resources that you can go to as a design team to get started on that. So that Pathways to Personalization website is really where we, every time we create a new resource or every time we get a resource refined enough to make it an open source so that it's ready to be kind of like shared out, they go up on that and we try and organize them by the chapters in the book. Yeah.
I'm wondering what criteria you might suggest when you're thinking about finding the right teachers for your pilot team. What criteria are important to finding someone who's successful as an early adopter?
So it's so important. We have an entire chapter just dedicated to that question, chapter 5. But it basically, so if you go through the Ina Blended Learning Teacher Competencies, the number one kind of place you start at, and it's obvious, everyone says it all the time now, is mindset, right? So it's really deeply, and hopefully there's somebody in the building that kind of knows enough about, like if you have a brand new first year principal, not the best place to start because there's a lot of folks that can fake mindset and you really need to actually know like who in that building has the right mindset. And the mindset meaning like that I actually believe that we need a new vision for teaching and learning in our building. Like that's the mindset you want at the table in the pilot teacher because of how messy the piloting process is. Then you start to get into some of the qualities of that teacher and things like grit and transparency. So like grit gets overused, I understand that, but in this work again, it's one day it's gonna suck, but the next day it's gonna get better, and the next day it's gonna get better, and you need the teacher that's gonna go through the suck to get to the get better. And then it starts to get into like some of the more technical qualities. We de-emphasize the technical qualities a lot. We think you can coach up on data expertise. We think you can coach up on how to use blended tools. We think you can coach up on how to run collaborative centers. Like we think you can coach up on a lot of the technical pieces, but the other pieces of like collaborative like belief that like if I'm doing this well and a teacher next door to me comes and knocks, I'm not gonna say like, well, it's not quite perfect, so you can't see it yet. Or I'm not gonna say, well, I spent 3 hours on a Sunday doing this, so you can't have it. Like that kind of like piece as well. And then there's one of the ones that's kind of, you know, as we've been doing more and more of this work, emerging to have more and more importance is the teachers that are able to both build interpersonal relationships with students, but also be able to take feedback on their interpersonal relationships with students. Because it's one thing to coach teachers around, the moves, the teacher moves. But it's another thing to coach teachers, to be open to being coached, to say, you don't actually have high expectations for these particular students. Or we're actually noticing that the tasks that you're giving are not rigorous, or when you're having these conversations, you're talking at them and not actually listening when they're saying these things. Like, those things are being open to the fact that you might have some bias in how you're approaching this work, and that you have some gap areas in terms of those. Like, that's a piece. So we go into it a little bit more like articulate than I was just able to do, but that's kind of like a big component, is picking the right pilot teachers to get started in this work. Good question. Any others? Yeah.
You said you had a grant program that you guys run. Did I hear that correctly?
So a lot of this is developed through our grant programs that we've received. There was one program that I mentioned called the Fuse Fellowship. It's an interesting program that we started. So when we first began this work in Rhode Island in 2013, it was in reaction to a massive one-to-one movement that was rolling across the state. And there were certain district leaders and superintendents that had kind of gotten a lot of shine, for lack of a better word, for going one-to-one. But when we would actually go into their classrooms, it was still completely teacher-centered, if they were even using the devices. And what we saw is that most of the conversation was around PD that was like point-and-click PD. And we saw very early that that was going to be a problem for the state in general over time. And so what we did was, we knew that there were certain classrooms across the state that we had kind of already kind of networked together, and these certain teachers that were doing incredible things and blending it with the technology. And so what we wanted to do is, we knew that the expertise lied at that level of the system, not at the level of the system that was actually making the decisions. That level of the system, when they had been in classrooms, had never used any of these things. They really had no knowledge of what was possible. And so we wanted to flip that. And so we created a fellowship by where the teachers that were doing this work applied. We would train them in a summer boot camp, and then we would actually so we would take, there's 66 districts across the tiny state of Rhode Island. I know it's crazy. But we would take them from one of their districts, take another one from another district, we would partner them, and then they would go into a third district, and we would form a design team, and they would facilitate the change effort in that district as experts doing the work in their own home districts. And so what it was meant to do is a couple things. It was meant to create a deeper bench of expertise across the state in all of the different pockets. You really can't throw a rock in Rhode Island without hitting a school that has a Fuse Fellow, or somebody that's been coached by a Fuse Fellow to some degree. And so it's moved that expertise into all of the different pockets around the state, but it also has made it so that when they go back to their home districts, their expertise is now, there's somebody there that kind of knows what good looks like and can kind of lead a lot of that work. And so that was kind of like a greasing of the wheel initiative that now is 5 years in, and we're really seeing a lot of that work kind of paying off. Now, it's also a pretty low level in terms of transformative change, because those fellows they were still in-service teachers and only had 5 days to kind of go into that district and coach early adopters and get this work kind of moving. But it definitely got the work moving. And then what happened from there is then people would then either re-engage with us or re-engage individually on their own and kind of continue the work. And so it was really more of a forcing function to get the work moving in the right direction. And so we have now started that fellowship in Massachusetts. There's conversation about that fellowship going into North Carolina. So we can bring that fellowship model to other places, but it was grant funded. It was free to schools and districts, and the fellows actually got paid a stipend to do that work. Yeah, no problem. All right. Any other questions? Did you no? You're just stretching. All right. Cool. Well, I think we're coming up on time. Thank you for your time. Oh, I gotta pick the raffle. So, like every raffle, this is going to be incredibly frustrating because probably I'll pick the first 10 names of people that aren't in the room. So we're only going to go to the people that are actually in the room. And we've got all sorts of different sizes and probably sticky notes was not the best idea for how to do this. But I'm going to mix this up. And I'm going to blindly select here. A tool. I know he left. I saw him walk out. Richard? He left. I'm telling you, we're going to be like this all day.
We're going to tell him to.
Oh, that one's stuck together. Sorry. Taryn? All right. So Taryn, you'll get one, and we'll go to the next one. I'm going to go deep for this one. And Jennifer? All right. All right. So there you go. Taryn and Jennifer. Yeah, no problem. No problem. All right. So once again, I'll be in the book signing room at 2 if you're interested. Thank you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Your role is so crucial in this work.